All right, so this is a very brief video that is meant as an introduction to the readings that we had for Rousseau. So as a reminder, we're reading, this is a little bit tricky, so bear with me. Rousseau has a work called The Second Discourse, often referred to as The Second Discourse. The full title, as you can see on the screen, is The Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men, otherwise known as The Discourse on Inequality. The reason this is called The Second Discourse is because um, he very famously, early in his life, wrote two discourses that served as responses to questions that were published by the Academy of Dijon. So the Academy of Dijon in the 1750s would hold these annual, almost sort of like essay contests that would solicit responses from whoever was interested in these questions. His first response from 1750 was a much shorter work that is now known as the Discourse on the Origin of the Sciences and the Arts. And the second discourse, written a few years later, is this one. And we'll talk about what that question was, the question that solicited this response. But just to return to the subject, our readings are, for Rousseau, the second part of the second discourse, as well as a selection of readings from a separate work that Rousseau produced a few years later called The Social Contract. So you've got lectures on YouTube here that will cover the second discourse and that will cover our readings from The Social Contract. This is just a very brief, hopefully I get this done in less than 10 minutes, a very brief introduction to the second discourse, just so that you have some sense of what's going on in the second discourse going into that lecture on the second part. So that's what this will serve to do, is to sort of introduce the second half of the second discourse. So as I mentioned before, this is an examination of the second discourse of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau wrote in French, so these are in translation. He was himself not French, but rather Genevan. Of course, today, which is in Switzerland, at the time was an independent city-state. Rousseau writes this work in the 1750s in response to a question that, as I mentioned, was published by the Academy of Dijon. And that question, it appears here on page 37 of the text. The question is this: what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by the natural law? And so what Rousseau does here in order to answer this question is he tries to examine, he tries to discover how we might have become unequal. Right? So the question is, here we're looking around middle 18th century France, and as we can look around now in the 21st century in America and pretty much all civilized societies, there is a lot of inequality. So there's inequality of wealth, right? There are rich and there are poor. There is inequality in terms of power, right? So there are some who have great and considerable social and political power, and those who have very little. So how did we become unequal? And you'll remember that this was a subject that occupied Hobbes and Locke as well. And again, I say again, Rousseau is very much participating in a kind of conversation here with Hobbes and Locke. All three of them are trying to determine sort of what we were like naturally and how we became the way we were. And as we've discussed, one of the reasons that they're interested in this question of how we became the way that we were is because they want to look around and they want to see which social and political conventions, right? So the fact that we have a monarchy, for example, or the fact that we protect great stores of private property, these social and political facts, which of these are legitimate social and political facts? And which one of these are illegitimate facts? Which one of these would we like to, if we could, overturn or address in some way? And so what we find in the second discourse is we find that for Rousseau, what Hobbes and Locke failed to do is they fail to go sufficiently far back enough. Right? This is a refrain that we find in the first part of the second discourse, which we do not read for this class, in which I'm just going to give you a very, very quick set of highlights for. What we find is that he looks at Hobbes and he looks at Locke and he looks at their account of natural man and he says, their natural man doesn't look very natural. Their natural man looks like someone that you would find today on the streets of London or on the streets of Paris or Geneva or whatever it may be. In particular, for example, he worries about Hobbes's account of natural man. So as we recall from Hobbes's account of natural man, man is naturally acquisitive, right? We constantly seek for power after power, right? The seeking that ceaseth only in death, he says, right? So we're always going after more and more power. That includes more and more wealth. But Rousseau's view is that, maybe we weren't always like that. If we look around the natural world, do we find any other animals that behave in this sort of way that are constantly seeking more and more power? What Hobbes thought was natural might be, Rousseau thinks, it might be something that we learned how to be. So he wants to say, I'm going to go all the way back. I'm going to find what we were like really and truly in the state of nature. And what we find is that Rousseau's natural man looks a lot more like an animal than Hobbes's and Locke's natural man does. He doesn't have reason, either the kind of sort of rigorous natural law oriented reason that Locke describes. He doesn't even have the kind of problem solving reason that Hobbes describes. He's much closer to, and of course, we've been in the 21st century, we have sort of evolutionary accounts of man's development from apes and things like that. And to be honest, Rousseau's account looks a lot like a creature that might have emerged from other forms of animal life. And so he launches into this discussion. Now, the second discourse, which, as I mentioned, is divided into two parts, the two parts basically do two different things. The part that we're reading, part two, describes how we might go from the natural state, how we might go from natural man to a civilized state, right? So, what is the speculative path of development that might occur over time? How do we get from being natural man to being civilized man? That's what part two does. And that's the part that we're going to look more closely at in the next lecture. In part one, he offers his vision of what natural man might actually look like. So, natural man, his only real subject is what is man like in the natural state? And here we see him sort of introducing the subject. This is page 39. Again, we did not have this as assigned reading. I'm just kind of pointing you guys to some highlights here. Oh man, whatever country you may be from, whatever your opinions may be, listen, here is your history as I have thought to read it, not in the books of your fellow men who are liars, but in nature who never lies. Everything that comes from nature will be true. There will be nothing false except I have unintentionally added. We see here already a recurrent theme with Rousseau, which is this strong normative emphasis on nature. That which is natural being sort of inherently superior, inherently better than what we find derived from civilization. Okay, so the first thing that we notice about his account of natural man is that Rousseau thinks natural man was far superior to civilized man, especially with respect to his body. So Rousseau thinks that natural man, here in this passage that I've highlighted here on page 40. This is just an example. Since the savage man's body is the only instrument he knows, he employs it for a variety of purposes that, for lack of practice, ours are incapable of serving. And our industry deprives us of the force and agility that necessity obliges him to acquire. If he'd had an axe, would his wrists break such strong branches? If he'd had a sling, would he throw a stone with so much force? If he'd had a ladder, would he climb a tree so nimbly? If he had a horse, would he run so fast? Give a civilized man time to gather all his machines around him, and undoubtedly he will easily overcome a savage man. But if you want to see an even more unequal fight, put them against each other naked and disarmed, and you will soon realize the advantage of constantly having all of one's forces at one's disposal, of always being ready for any event, and of always carrying one's entire self, as it were, with one. Right? So for Rousseau, civilization deprives us of our natural forces. We have axes and we have homes and we have cars. And because we have all these machines around us, we don't have to develop any of the sorts of skills that these machines take care of themselves. So because we have cars, we don't have the ability to walk or to run for great distances. And because we have homes, we don't have the kind of durability necessary to take care of ourselves outdoors and stuff like that. So for Rousseau, the first thing to notice is that natural man is far more capable, far abler than civilized man, at least with respect to his physical condition. And by the way, Rousseau also thinks that natural man would be far healthier than civilized man in other ways. So he thinks, for example, that he'd be less susceptible to disease, that, because natural men with any sort of deformation would die relatively quickly, those who live to adulthood would be um, pretty flawless specimens. Okay, so that's man in his natural state. He also wants, I'm sorry, natural man in his physical state. He also wants to say a few words about natural man in what he calls his spiritual condition. So, what is natural man like in terms of his behavior, in terms of his mind? And what we find is that Rousseau thinks that natural man will have essentially two faculties that he shares with the animals that are particularly worth mentioning, and two faculties that he thinks are unique to human beings. So the two faculties that he thinks are unique to human beings are, on the one hand, freedom, which is to say that human beings, unlike animals, seem to have this ability, this capacity to choose things beyond and even sometimes against what their instinct tells them to do. So if we read here on page 44, in any animal, I see nothing but an ingenious machine to which nature has given senses in order for it to renew its strength and to protect itself to a certain point from all that tends to destroy or disturb it. I am aware of precisely the same thing in the human machine, with the difference that nature alone does everything in the operations of an animal, whereas man contributes as a free agent to his own operations. The former chooses or rejects by instinct, and the later by an act of freedom. So, animals, for example, cannot. So when an animal searches for food, for example, it does so in a highly instinctual fashion. And so an animal feels this instinctual need for food and it goes and it satisfies that. It knows what kinds of foods are good for it. It knows what kinds of foods it likes to eat. And it goes and it finds that and it eats until it's full, right? It listens to its body on this thing. Human beings can do a variety of things with respect to food. The most important one for Rousseau is that a human being can choose if they wish. A human being can actually choose to act against their instinctual drive for food. So, human beings, for example, can go on hunger strike. That would suggest that even something as fundamental to the body, something as instinctual as feeding itself, even with respect to something like that, human beings have a certain amount of freedom within them, whereas animals do not. So this is distinctive to human beings. They have this capacity for choice. This he thinks is good, and this will come back in the social contract. They also have this second faculty, which he sometimes referred to as the faculty of perfectibility. So here we see on the next page is page 45. But if the difficulties surrounding all these questions should leave some room for dispute on this difference between man and animal, there is another very specific quality which distinguishes them and about which there can be no argument, the faculty of self-perfection, a faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, successively develops all the others and resides among us as much in the species as in the individual. So this is an interesting idea, and Rousseau's point is relatively straightforward. Animals tend not to change either in the individual or in the species, like at the species level. Right? So we even have a phrase to describe this. You can't teach old dogs new tricks. I'm actually not sure if that's true, but generally speaking, a dog, when it's fully formed, is going to be that dog for the rest of its life. It's probably not going to learn to speak, for example. It's probably not going to learn to play any extremely sophisticated games. It's going to be pretty much that dog for the rest of its life. More importantly, with respect to the species, what we don't see among animals is a lot of change across generations, at least change with respect to conscious choices. Right. So we might see slow adaptations over time. And in fact, this is what evolution describes. But what we don't see among animals is we don't see them adopting widespread tool use, for example. We don't see them adopting new living arrangements, for example, that are fundamentally different from what we've seen with them before. And if we do see what looks to be something like a wholesale change in their living arrangements or in their tool use, they tend to die out pretty quickly, usually within a single generation. And there's all sorts of reasons for this. Animals can't talk. They have a very difficult time communicating complex ideas to each other. And so they can't really teach future generations how to do this. kind of thing. Human beings, on the other hand, totally different phenomenon. Human beings have a way of developing, of refining, of accumulating cultural changes over time. So human beings in one place tend not to look like human beings in another in terms of their living arrangements, in terms of the kind of tools that they use, in terms of their way of life. And if you look at the same group of people over time, we see a lot of change. So he calls this perfectibility. And this, he thinks, is actually one of the great problems that human beings are charged with. The rest of part one, um, he uses, actually, oh, sorry, real quick. So I said that there were two faculties that distinguished human beings from animals, and we just talked about those, freedom and perfectibility. And he also points out two faculties that we share with the animals, two faculties that motivate us. So these are sort of faculties or instincts or drives that we have in us naturally. One of them is something like what we might just call material self-interest. And so, like all successful animals, human beings have within them the drive to acquire food, for example, to attain safety, to fight enemies, to acquire prey, to do all this kind of stuff. So he calls this something like self-love. We want to see ourselves survive, and so we act on this need for survival. But again, all animals are motivated in this way, and this is something that we share with them. All animals get up in the morning and they try to figure out how to stay alive, how to acquire food, how to protect themselves from predators, and how to acquire any prey that they might need. And so this self-love or this sort of self-interest, material self-interest, is something that we share with them and that motivates us all. On top of that, this is a kind of odd sort of thing that's really unique to Rousseau. He also thinks that we have a natural sentiment, which he calls pity. The French is the word pitié, which this translator has chosen to translate as pity. We might translate it as something like sympathy or compassion. It's kind of a funny idea, but Rousseau thinks that we have a natural way of feeling what other people are feeling. And in particular, and this is very strong in us, he thinks we don't like to see other people suffer, that we suffer when we see others suffer. And what's interesting is that he thinks this is something that we share with animals. He thinks that animals likewise have this natural sentiment where they abhor suffering in other members of their species. Actually, I don't think this is true. This doesn't even seem like something that would be true to me. But Rousseau does think it's an animal sentiment that we have. It's sort of sub-rational or pre-rational. But he thinks it's what prevents us from just murdering each other all the time. So just to kind of recap here, we've got four faculties that he points out. We have on the one hand, human freedom and human perfectibility, which we discussed. And then we have also this sort of material self-interest or self-love that motivates us to keep ourselves alive. And on top of that, we have this natural sentiment of pitié or pity or compassion. He spends the rest of the book sort of just describing what like if we were just to observe the natural man over the course of a day, what we would find. And again, the emphasis here in what we want to take over into our reading in the second part of the second discourse is that natural man lives in a very animalistic fashion, by which I mean he doesn't have language, he doesn't have property, he doesn't have any sort of long-term possessions, he doesn't think in abstract thoughts. He isn't really motivated by a sense of time, right? So he doesn't, he doesn't think about what he's going to do tomorrow in the same way that animals don't think about this kind of stuff. He's sort of motivated by whatever's happening in the moment, right? So he lives very much in the moment. And then finally, and this is actually really important as a final sort of remark before we get into the second part of the second discourse, natural man for Rousseau is not like a pack animal. He's not naturally sociable. Natural man lives alone. And it's this fact that he lives alone, it's this fact that leads him to not develop language, to not have any sort of permanent relations with anyone else, to not have a kind of sense of time. All of these things are things that we will acquire once we begin to live in society, once we begin to live in proximity with one another. So I'll stop there. You do not need to read part one of the second discourse. You can if you want. It's one half of one of the great classics in social and political thought. I've just kind of, again, highlighted what you will need to know going into our discussion of part two. And you can stop here and we'll jump into part two now.